The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show. I hope you're all having a wonderful long weekend. All right. It's hope you had good Martin Luther King's Day. It's holiday in I know many parts of the country. It's not everybody gets time off, but PR Beach, great place to collect vitamin D3. Yeah, absolutely. Although it's good to supplement as well because you don't go to the beach every day. So it's good to get your vitamin D, one of the few vitamins that actually seems to have actual science behind the need for it and the fact that most of us have too little. All right, today we are going to talk about racism. We're going to talk about racism. It's Martin Luther King Day. It seems appropriate. That is, after all, his legacy is fighting racism and fighting for rights and for equal treatment under the law. And that is a legacy, I think, worth celebrating. I mean, not everything Martin Luther King stood for was good. Not all of his ideas are worth celebrating. But certainly the struggle for equality before the law, certainly the struggle against racism, against Jim Crow, against redlining, against the kind of attitudes were so prevalent in the United States, particularly in the South of the United States during the 1950s and 1960s, that is worth celebrating. So from that perspective, Martin Luther King certainly is a hero and also, I think, a fighter against racism of a different generation and of really a different kind than many of those who claim to be fighting racism today in the African American community and elsewhere, not just blacks but whites, but generally people who fight racism today are very, very, very different, and we'll talk about that. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it. So, obviously today's a good day. Racism has been a topic in the news the last year, certainly since since the summer when we had the riots following the death of George Floyd. We had demonstrations, many demonstrations. Several of those demonstrations turned into riots. Some of those riots got kind of a life of their own, and in some places like Portland, Oregon, I think they're still going on months and months and months and months after. But all of this started, all of these demonstrations, all of these riots started with the idea of fighting against racism. The assumption was that racism is prevalent. We've heard all year long of how systemic racism rules America. So it's a good time to reflect back. I talked a lot about this topic during the summer, but it's been a while. We haven't talked about it recently, so it's good to do a refresher and bring this back. So, why does this issue keep coming up? Why is racism an issue? Why is it constantly being made an issue? Well, because the fact is that this country has a long and ugly history with racism. Slavery, obviously, for over 100 years. Slavery is not the defining characteristic of the United States, as the 1619 Project would assert. Racism is not a sin that wipes out any achievement that is the United States, as many people on the left would argue. But racism and slavery are a black mark on American history. It is the great evil at the founding. Not an evil big enough to wipe out the great virtues of the founding, but yet a compromise, a moral compromise, a political compromise that led to 80 years of a country that had one of the most evil institutions in human history. I mean, that's been around for most of human history, but yet an evil institution, the institution of slavery, and ultimately led to a civil war which resulted in the death of 600,000 people. So slavery is not just a little issue. Slavery is a major issue in American history and needs to be confronted. And it would be one thing if after slavery was abolished, after the Civil War, that was it. Then racism had no impact on American history post that. But unfortunately, that is not the case. It is the case that racism continued to have a profound impact, certainly on parts of the U.S., primarily in the South, but really throughout the United States. Redlining as a government policy, not a bank policy, a government policy, was prevalent throughout America, all the way far west as California, Chicago, Detroit to the north, and much of the East Coast. Jim Crow laws in the South are a true disgrace. They're truly something that should be condemned in the harshest way. Businesses that only served whites, while they had a right to do it, are despicable and morally despicable and should be condemned as such, but not to mention lynchings, unequal treatment before the law, and a whole host of evils that resulted in the South during this period, and unfortunately got exported, at least to some extent, to the North in the early part of the 20th century. So, racism is a part of this country's history. It's a part that cannot be ignored. It's a part that needs to be dealt with. And of course, the 1960s saw a civil rights movement that tried to put an end to the unequal treatment before the law that Jim Crow and racist laws like redlining had brought upon the United States. And to a large extent, it was successful. Those laws were eradicated. Those laws were eliminated. And if anything, one could argue that some of the remedies that were put in place to combat the really systemic government-instituted, government-defended racism in the United States, actually some of the remedies made things worse in the long run, actually institutionalized racism. Things like affirmative action, things like the outlawing of any kind of discrimination in private businesses, which have created massive confusion and massive distortion, I think. So the 1960s were a massive success. The civil rights movement was a massive success. And to a large extent, I think the American population over the last 50, 60 years, even in the South, maybe primarily in the South, as individuals have come a long way in changing their attitudes towards racism. Whereas racism in the 1940s, 50s, 60s was open, people weren't embarrassed or ashamed by it, they were actually proud of it. Most people in modern America would never admit to being racist, even when they are. Racism has become a four-letter word. It becomes something that is morally reprehensible. And people do not admit to being racist. But also, I think people's, as individuals, attitudes towards race have changed. People are far less concerned with issues of race today than they were back then. I mean, until the 1960s, it was illegal to have, to a black woman to marry a black man, a white man, or interracial marriages were illegal. But even in places where they weren't illegal, they were frowned upon. Today, nobody thinks twice about it. Nobody considers it. I mean, some people do, I know. But for the most part, as a culture, much of the overt racism is gone. And much of the individual racism is gone. Yes, people still make racial slurs. People still slide into different forms of prejudice. But it's nothing like the kind of racism that was so prevalent in decades past. So we have come a huge way. And one of the things that I find disappointing and upsetting, and I think really harmful to the cause, is that people fighting racism today will not acknowledge any of that. They will claim that there's just as much racism today as there was 60 years ago, that nothing has changed, that we still live in an oppressive, white supremacist culture where systemic racism is prevalent everywhere. And that's just nonsense. Much progress has been made. Yes, there's still racism around. Yes, there's still some evidence that even the law doesn't treat everybody the same always. Yes, there's still racists out there, and we'll talk about who those racists are in a little while. And yes, some policemen are probably racist and behave badly. But as a culture, we have come so far. So far. That not to acknowledge that is to undermine and undercut everything that you stand for if you stand against racism. So I think today we have a culture. Put aside kind of the extremes of the political culture in America. We have a culture that's generally, overall, come a long way in terms of being less racist, being much more accepting, being much more tolerant. And we've moved, particularly in parts of this country, much more towards the goal, which is colorblindness. The goal, which is not caring about somebody's skin color. Now, I've said in the past, let's take a step back a second and define what we mean by racism. Because even there, today, there is massive confusion. Racism is the idea of treating an individual, not treating him not based on his character, not based on his actions, but based on the color of his skin, based on his ethnic origins, based on some unchosen characteristic that has to do with what people term as race. Something to do with his ethnic, his genetic, his skin color. That is what racism is. It's not inequality. It's not some kind of collectivist term. It's a term that applies to an individual who evaluates people based on their membership in a group identified as race. Now, the ideal, now this is evil. Why is this evil? Because it is defining somebody based on something non-essential. It is defining somebody based on his membership in a group. It is anti-justice because it is not treating the actions, the character of the individual as essential, but treating something that's non-essential, irrelevant, and unchosen as the basis by which to deal with a person. Now, that is the opposite of justice. That is the essence of injustice. And it is a rejection of the whole idea of individualism, of treating people as individuals, not as members of tribes, not as members of groups, not as members of collectives. Why is the video not on? Wait. Site. Oh, there it is. It's working. All right. So it's a complete negation of the whole foundation of what this country is based on, the rights of individuals, the idea that individuals are what matter, and the idea that you have a mind and therefore you shape your own moral character, that you're not evil because of your genes. That individuals shape their own character, that individuals make choices, that individuals can think for themselves, that individuals have control over their own lives. That is the basic assumptions of the Enlightenment that made this possible, that made this country possible. And the principles on which this country was based, and more importantly, the principles of an individualistic ethic. Racism negates all that. And it is evil because it is unjust, because it is corrupting, it is anti your self-interest. It is destructive to you and to everyone around you. All right. So in eradicating racism, what is the goal? Well, in eradicating racism is to eradicate that kind of judgment. To stop people using other people's race, genetics, as a standard, as a criteria for evaluation. You want to eradicate racism because you want to live in a just society. You want to live in a society of rational people. You want to live in a society of justice, a society in which the non-essential, in which the unchosen is not judged morally. You want to live in a society of people who are colorblind. Now, I've said in the past, and I'll say it again, and I still believe this, that race in and of itself is an illegitimate concept. There are populations out there that come from different parts of the world. There are people with different skin colors. There are people who have different genetic makeup. There's some groups that have more similarities among them than other groups. But usually, the differences within a group are greater than the differences between groups. There is no way to actually categorize races. I mean, eugenics have tried over and over again. And the more we understand about genetics, the more we know that you cannot do it. Yes, the differences, but there are no hard lines. There are no clear distinctions. There are no clear characteristics. But it seems like the more culture become collectivists, like ours, the more people try to find differences. The more people invest in finding differences. The more people want to emphasize the differences. The more people want to stand by the concept of race. The more people want to proudly proclaim that there is such a thing as race. But it doesn't exist. All that exists are individuals. Individuals that have differences because they have different genes. And those genes determine certain things about you. Primarily your biology. Your genetic makeup is important for your health and for how you look. But it's not important for who you are. It's not important for your moral value. It's not important for the choices you make. It's not important for what you make of yourself. So race, to begin with, is a myth created by people who dislike people who look differently than them. And therefore, the goal of those who actually oppose racism should be to make the case that there is no such thing as race, that all that matters are individuals, that individuals should be judged as individuals, and that we should pay no heed one way or the other to somebody's race. I just saw a TV show. It was interesting. A TV show, and I can't, Brighton, something like that. I think it's on Netflix. It's a bit of a silly romance show, set in an alternative kind of history of 1813 London, and it's romance and Bridgeton. Thank you, Bridgeton. And it's mostly silly, and it's not a series I'm going to recommend. But what I found really intriguing about it, and I actually really liked it, is that they basically cast black actors and white actors, and it didn't, there wasn't black roles and white roles. The black people weren't representing black people, and white people weren't representing white people. They were just representing people. They were all, the show is about aristocrats. So all aristocrats. Of course, in those days in England, there were no black aristocrats, but there were. So here they're black aristocrats. But they're not viewed as black aristocrats. Ooh, that's weird. They're just aristocrats. There's no issue with intermarriage. There's no issue with anything other than the stupid hierarchy of classes in British society. But a complete colorblindness. Now, they had a kind of explain this, so they had a stupid explanation for it. Something about the king falling in love with a black woman and making a queen, and therefore now it's a colorblind society. But that doesn't make any sense, because they're families that have, like the Dukes, that have a long history, that are all black, going back, way back into history in this thing, right? It's ahistorical, but so what? It's fiction. It's an alternative history, but the beauty of it is you don't care. What difference does it make? The actors are acting a particular type. It's alternative history. It's historical fiction. But why should historical fiction be focused on the color of people's skin? Why shouldn't historical fiction be focused on their character, the culture? That's what historical fiction should be about. I mean, why shouldn't James Bond? I mean, I'd love to see Idris Elba, is that his name? Play James Bond. I think he'd be a great James Bond. But the whole idea of the color of somebody's skin is irrelevant. It's unimportant. It doesn't matter. Yeah, but it doesn't matter. You're writing fiction. And you're changing history. That's what often happens in historical fiction. And you're making race irrelevant and choosing to focus on the romance. And that's completely appropriate. And I found it quite charming and refreshing and cool. So the ideal, Idris Elba, thank you. Idris Elba I really like him as an actor. I first discovered Idris Elba in The Wire. He played one of the drug dealers. He played the one who goes to business school because he wants to run it like a real business. So he goes to business school at night to study up, to figure out how to run the drug business as a real business. But he's a really good actor. Then he's got a kind of a really, really, really dark cop show in the UK, Luther, it's called Luther. Highly recommended, but very violent, very dark, very upsetting. But he's brilliant in it. So he's been one of my favorite actors since I saw him in The Wire. And I think he's got that charm and that presence that would make a good James Bond. Although he's getting older, it might not be appropriate. So the ideal, the goal, before I get to that, this is an interesting question. If you made a movie about slavery, would you cast white people as slaves? Maybe. So it depends on what the purpose of the movie was and whether I wanted to focus on the fact that slaves were black. But even historically, slaves have been white. I mean, Spartacus is a good example of a white slave. So if you were doing a movie about slavery in America in the 19th century, no, you would make them black because part of the issue of slavery was that they were black. But the issue of romance in the court of King George in the early 1800s and the relationships between people and how they played out and the hierarchy between dukes and whatever the other hierarchy, the other people within the hierarchy of aristocracy is, has no relevance. Race has no relevance to that story. Now, you could make a movie about 1813 where race is very important. For example, about, slave trade or about anything that related to the conflict between white and black or the conflict around race. But if you're making a movie about where the theme, the topic, everything is about something unrelated to race, where race is irrelevant, then race is irrelevant. It's about the romance. Even if at the time race was relevant, that's not what you're dealing with in this movie. All right. Now, this is the challenge. The problem is that the civil rights movement, the people who claim to be the descendants of Martin Luther King, the people who claim to be fighting racism today in the black community and the white and among whites, generally the people who are passionate about the issue of racism and advocating against it and leading the charge against racism, do not understand what racism is, have never clearly defined it, certainly not in the terms that Martin Luther King did, or that I did earlier. Those fighting against racism today are not striving towards colorblindness, and indeed have not rejected the idea of race. Or if they have accepted the idea of race for now, with some utopian vision of one day we'll understand a race doesn't exist. The critical race theory, the Black Lives Matter, the white fragility, the anti-racism movements that are out there today embrace collectivism. Embrace race. Embrace the differences between races and the fact that races should and must be treated differently. The whole idea of critical race theory is that you are determined by your race. The whole idea of white fragility is that by their very nature of being white, you are racist whether you are a racist or not, whether you act as a racist or not. And it's only through acknowledging that whether you accept racist ideas or not, you're racist just by the very fact that you're white and by being part of a system that is racist, can you achieve virtue. The people fighting racism today, the people who claim to be fighting racism today, are the biggest racists in America today. If what you mean by racist is evaluating and judging somebody by the color of their skin, by their genes, by their membership in some ethnic group, then critical race theory is the essence of racism. It is a racist theory. White fragility is a racist idea that judges white people because they are white, not me, not you, but judges us as individuals, but judges us as a collective, as members of being white. What they hate, what they're fighting against is not racism. What the anti-racists really despise is America. And not just the racist history of America, which deserves to be hated and condemned. But they despise the nature of America, the freedom of America, the individualism of America, the capitalism of America. All those things that are actually truly anti-racist, truly embody a negation of racism. Those are the actual things that they hate. Those are the actual things that they despise. So, we all know, I think, all those listening to the show know, that the cure for racism is individualism, capitalism, freedom, the respect for individual rights, the limiting of the role of government to the protection of individual rights, equality before the law, the ideas on which this country was founded. These are all the ideas that these advocates, supposedly, who claim to be fighting against racism, these are all the ideas that they reject, that they don't want, that they think are and have labeled as systemic racism. Matt asked if MLK was a socialist. Probably. Or at least he was, I don't know exactly how socialist he was, but he's definitely on the left when it comes to economic policy. Significantly on the left. Does that wipe out his virtues? I don't think so. I don't think so. It doesn't make him a saint. He was also quite religious, right? He was a preacher. He was a socialist religionist. And yet, he understood what racism was, understood what the ideal, the anti-racist ideal was far better than the intellectuals of today. And I think to call the intellectuals of today these so-called anti-racists, socialists would be a compliment. They don't have an ideal for a different system. They don't have a vision for something better. What they want, what they hate is America. What they hate is capitalism. What they hate is the system of individual rights. They want to do away with that. In that sense, they're much more nihilistic. I don't think Martin Luther King was a nihilist. He was an idealist. He was a mistaken idealist, certainly in his socialism, but he was an idealist. And he had principles, he had ideas, he had things worth fighting for, and he risked his life to fight for them. What today's far left, what today's anti-racist, the intellectuals behind BLM, not everybody who marched in BLM, the intellectuals behind BLM, the critical race theory, they're not building anything. They're not creating anything. They're not moving the world to a better place. They're not fighting for rights. They're not fighting for anything. What they want is to dismantle the existing system, not to replace it with something better. They can't imagine something better. All they want, and all they argue for, and all they talk about is doing away, destroying the existing system. I mean, according to this one author, what's her name? Barbara Smith, who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize at some point. So she's a well-known civil rights activist, I guess. She says, and here you see the collectivism inherent in what they do. White supremacy is not merely the individual delusion of being superior. Notice the individual. White supremacy is not merely the individual delusion of being superior to black people. I thought that's exactly what white supremacy is. White supremacy is white people, individuals, thinking they're better than blacks because they're whites and those guys are blacks. That's literally what white supremacy means. But to her, it isn't. It's not merely that. She says institutionalized white supremacy does not need individual bigotry in order to function. So even if all of us were literally colorblind, had not a racist bone in our body, treated everybody based on the content of their character, on their ability, on who and what they were as an individual, even then, she says, systemic racism would exist. It's, she says, a universal operating system that relies on entrenched patterns and practices to consistently disadvantage people of color and privilege white people. Now, how does this work? She never says. They never say. They never lay it out. They never give you concretes. How does this work without individuals being racist? How can the system be racist? How can, if individual policemen are not racist, how can the police be racist? Well, they say because the laws criminalize behavior that only blacks engage in and not whites. You know, and they usually bring up crack cocaine. Well, okay, well then fix the laws. If those, then let's make a list of the 10 laws that need fixing and fix the laws. But that is because those laws exist because individuals were racist. Individuals wanted to punish blacks differently than they want to punish whites, which is racism. But if individuals are not racist, then they would never pass laws like that. And if there are laws entrenched in our country that still have those racist roots, then let's get rid of them. That's easy. But you see, to them, capitalism by its very nature, freedom by its very nature, individuals choosing based on people's moral character, individuals choosing based on people's ability, people getting compensated based on ability, people making wealth based on how much they produced. All of that is bigoted. All of that is wrong. All of that is immoral. And they have now adopted the language of racism in order to characterize all of that as immoral. Because they know the extent to which our culture has rejected racism. So what they're trying to do is package deal America with racism. Package deal capitalism with racism. Package deal, in a sense, freedom with racism. Suddenly package deal individualism with racism. And if they can do that, then people will turn away from capitalism. People will turn away from individualism because they think, oh my God, I don't want to be a racist. And if individualism means racism, if capitalism means racism, I don't want to be an individualist and I don't want to be a racist. I don't want to be a capitalist. Now, whether they are doing this consciously or not is hard to tell. But this is what their nihilism is driving them to do. It's to associate anything they don't like with racism because they understand, and this is where it is conscious, they understand the power of racism. They understand the extent to which racism is viewed in our culture as evil and bad. And therefore they want to associate all the things they hate with the racism. She writes, I mean, this is just stunning. Our current version of policing is rooted in the slave patrols whose job was to capture people who had escaped, to criminalize black bodies, and to curtail black freedom. Now, as far as I know, our policing in the United States is very similar to policing in Europe, which is very similar to policing in, I don't know, almost every other country in the world. Countries that don't have the history of racism that the United States has, don't have the history of slavery that the United States has. And yet they still use the same policing tactics. Maybe policing is actually there to protect individual property. Maybe policing is there to protect individuals' lives. Japan policing is very similar to American policing. It's not dramatically different. And yes, way too many people are in prison. Way too many of those people are black. The fact that we've criminalized nonviolent, victimless actions is a tragedy and a travesty and a massive injustice. Massive injustice. And maybe some of that is motivated by race. So let's fight for decriminalizing drugs or legalizing drugs. Not because drug laws are racist, but because drug laws are unjust. All right. You know, as awful as I still think it was a murder of George Floyd was, I don't know that there's ever evidence that it was done because the policeman was a racist versus the policeman was just a jerk and incompetent, thoughtless. Breonna Taylor, I mean, it's awful to have no-knock raids. And the whole kind of raids that they're engaged in all over, drug trade again. I mean, the number of people who die every year because of the drug trade and the criminalization of drugs is horrific. But was Breonna Taylor shot because she was black? Or because she got in the crossfire of a raid gone bad, a raid gone wrong? But every injustice in society, every case of poverty, everywhere where these people, most of them on the left, see some kind of injustice, is blamed on racism because that is what motivates moral indignation. We are all against, or at least we believe we are, all against racism. Now, what's tragic about this is I think that there is an increase in white racism in the country over the last decade. That white nationalism, white supremacy, alt-right, all kinds of varieties of racists do exist and are growing. And those fighting racism, and let me add to that, I also think there is a lot of just more subtle racism. I think we haven't completely overcome the racism of the last 250 years. There's still some subtle things. I'm sure there's some laws that need to be changing. I'm sure there's some things where people are biased against. I also think that the fact that we instituted welfare at the same time as, for example, the black community was coming out of poverty, we then started giving them checks to keep them poor, is oppressive and, has real detriments for minority communities. there is a real rise in real white supremacy. And it's almost impossible to fight that if you're a racist too. So the people who are supposedly fighting racism are racists. The critical race theory, the BLM, the white fragility, the anti-racism movements are all racist movements trying to fight against racism. But all they're really trying to fight against is white people. The white people who are trying to fight against them because they're not white. So what we've got is groups that all accept that race matters, that race is important, fighting it out. And there's almost no voice in the debate. There's almost no voice in the debate for Martin Luther King, for the people who had some respect for the individual and viewed racism as something individuals do, and viewed the solution to racism in changing the way people think, and therefore the way people act. The solution to racism as being a return to individualism and treating people as individuals. Well, neither people on the right or on the left of this issue want that, care about that. There is no voice for a proper way to deal with racism. And the consequence of this, the consequence of both the left and the right embracing race as important, is that race becomes important to more and more people. Racism becomes more and more prevalent. The left attacks the whites, so the whites attack the left, and the other whites who typically maybe have not been racist in the past now feel under attack by certain black intellectuals and therefore rally around their brethren white people, whatever the hell that means, and become racist. Now, rational individualists don't do that, but I've seen people who I thought were rational individualists do it. The more identitarian, the more racist the blacks become, the more identitarian and racist the whites will become. Now, historically, the whites started it. There's no question about that. But racism in America was in decline. The civil rights movement did succeed. It made profound differences. It did change the world. But those achievements are going to be reversed by the people who benefited from those achievements, by those minorities who now clamor for more emphasis on race, for more discussion of race, for more looking at race. Now, white nationalism is huge. It's all over the place. I mean, you saw it on January 6th in the Capitol. I mean, anybody carrying a flag of the Confederacy is celebrating slavery, celebrating racism. Whether they completely embrace the idea or not, they are white supremacists of one form or another. There is no meaning to the Confederate flag other than a flag representing the states that left the Union or tried to leave the Union, tried to secede from the Union in order to preserve slavery. You saw Confederate flags all over the place. You see it in rallies of the right, not just the alt-right, but of the right all the time. Some white supremacists have a new spin on these things. They don't call themselves white supremacists. Now they call themselves white nationalists. This is what you saw with people like Stefan Molyneux and others. They say, oh, no. I'm not saying whites are superior to blacks. Not making that claim at all, they say. But oh, by the way, whites have a higher IQ than blacks. But no, I'm not claiming that they're superior, they say. Right? All I want is I want white people to live together and black people to live together peacefully but separate. Because whites are different and blacks are different. Not superior, even though the differences in IQ, but separately. White separatism. But of course that's white supremacy. Of course that's racism. It's certainly collectivism. And it's just as disgusting. It just sounds better. So, we have a rising, I mean, by the way, one of the really horrible things I saw in the rally at the Capitol were people wearing these T-shirts, and it was more than one. People wearing these T-shirts denying the Holocaust, or 6 million was not enough. I mean, wow. I mean, who would have thought in America you would see that? Not me when I came to this country 33 years ago. I never imagined that I'd see as much racism and anti-Semitism as I've seen in the last few years, that it bubbled up to the surface in the last few years. Right. White nationalism, supremacy, alt-right, all the different new right variations. That is increasing. Partially as a response to the critical race theory, BLM, the whole white fragility movement and all of that stuff. A lot of that is that. And part of it is because it's always existed. And part of it is the frustration, the alienation that we talked about many times on this show. Much of it caused by economic struggles, and on top of that, on top of the economic struggles, you know, the intellectuals telling and alienating and confusing and distorting people's view of reality. But the fact is, racism on left and right is rising. It's getting worse. Anti-Semitism on the left has become an issue, particularly in its hatred of Israel. White nationalists, white supremacists, anti-Semites are no friends of capitalism, no friend of America, no friends of individualism, quite the contrary. So now you've got anti-Semitism on left and right. You've got racism on left and right. And again, you've got to recognize that those of us who stand for individualism, those of us who stand for capitalism, those of us who stand for the principles of the Founding Fathers are no longer on left or right. We're on a completely different axis. Left and right are so much more similar than they are different. They share a fundamental collectivistic view, a fundamentally collectivistic, statist view and racist view of the world. Objectivism is way over there as individualistic, not buying into the collectivism of left or right, not buying into collectivism of anybody. Ryan, thank you. I really appreciate the support. So I want to emphasize, we have no allies in this struggle. There is a struggle against racism that, you know, nobody else is going to lead except the individualists among us. It is a struggle that is going to be very difficult because the powers arrayed against or for racism are vast. They dominate the universities and they dominate the streets. They dominate the left, the far left, and they dominate the far right. Identity politics has become central to our times, central to what's taught at universities. We've got a lot of work in front of us. The battle should be easy, because what are we arguing for? We're arguing for treating people as individuals, evaluating people based on their character, based on their moral virtues and values, based on their actions. We argue for a political, economic system that is based on justice, based on ability, based on hard work, based on production, based on value creation. You produce, you create, you build, you make. You earn. You don't. Color skin doesn't matter. Ethnic background doesn't matter. Your genes don't matter. Now, sure, your genes matter to certain potentialities. You're limited to some extent by your biology. There's no question. Just like I can't play basketball like LeBron James, I can't do physics like Einstein. And that's probably, not probably, that's certainly, to a large extent, a function of biology. But that is not what determines your moral character. That does not determine what your value is as a human being. It doesn't determine who you become and who you are. And it doesn't even determine how much you earn ultimately, because most people who earn a lot of money are not Einsteins. They don't have that capacity to abstractly think about physics. But so what? So while biology sets the terms, it's you, your free will, your decisions, your actions, your choices as an individual that shape who you are and what you become and what you do with your life. And genes and your race and your ethnic background and where you come from and the geographic place and who your parents were has nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. That's what we should be fighting for. We should be fighting for a positive. We should be fighting for individualism. And only a massive effort to educate people on the virtues, necessity of individualism can eradicate racism from our world. And now we have to fight all sides. Even on the racism stuff. I mean, it was one thing, at least Martin Luther King, to some extent at least, I think to a large extent, agreed with us on racism. We'd have to fight him on the socialism. Now we have to fight them on everything. The left is bad on everything. The far left. And the far right is bad on everything. They're just as collectivist, they're just as statist, they're just as racist, they're just as... And the number of allies we have, the number of people we have a common terminology with or common ideas with has shrunk dramatically. All right. Let's see. Let's take some super chat questions. Let me just find ones that are relevant. All right. Was it virtue signaling when some in the liberty movement responded to leftist mobs by calling for police reforms versus defending property more loudly? You see, I don't like the term virtue signaling. I get what it's trying to do. But as I told you in the past, I think the person you're mostly signaling to is yourself. And what you're signaling to yourself about it's about the morality of altruism. So it doesn't surprise me that people who buy into altruism, even people in the liberty movement who buy into altruism, would first look at who's in need and who needs to be sacrificed to and who needs to be taken care of as the first thing you deal with. And that's virtue signaling to self, to my own morality. And yes, some of it is to the group around them, appeasing the people around them. Social signaling, virtue signaling. You should call it virtue social signaling or something like that. But I also think that they were onto something. Not in the sense that they maybe overdid it, but police does need to be reformed. There's no question about it. And it's about the police using deadly force way too often. Using deadly force where, at least based on the video, if they knew a little bit of something like martial arts or something like that, if they were in good physical shape, they wouldn't have to. They could subdue the person they were trying to arrest without having to shoot them. I would like to see police reform, which means training the police in ways to both eliminate the threat somebody poses, protect themselves, while minimizing the use of deadly force. Now, and then I'm not against deadly force when the circumstances require it. But when they don't, it strikes me as, I think police should be in good shape. I think if you're out on the beat, if you're going to chase down criminals, you need to be in good shape, and you need to have an evaluation. You should be fired if you're not in good shape, or given a desk job if you're not in good shape. I think there should be physical requirements. I think they should all be trained in something like Krav Maga or Jiu-Jitsu or whatever. I mean, when we send people into the military, they are trained, and they're expected to stay in shape. As long as they're going to be in combat, they're in shape. And they get trained regularly in how to use weapons and how to do hand-to-hand combat and how to do the things they need to do in order to do their job. And I think the police need to be viewed with the same professionalism that we view the military. We need to take policing much more seriously. And maybe, and I'm sure we could, have, far fewer police, but train them much better, spend more money on the training and on them, get rid of a bunch of the bureaucracy associated with the police. And I think the police would be better, they would serve our interests better, they would protect us better, and the likelihood of us being shot by a policeman would go down, which is a good thing. And this, you've seen videos of just horrific things where the police do things that are just ridiculous. Where if they had any kind of abilities, trained in any kind of martial arts, they could deal with these situations without having to shoot somebody in the back 7 times. Right? But they're not. So it's hard to blame them when they feel like their life is threatened or going to be threatened, they've got a gun, not to use the gun. Because they haven't been properly trained. Have you read that some black people don't trust the vaccine will be safe for them because they think their dose will be tainted? Yes. I mean, some white people think the same thing. I mean, there's a whole conspiracy theory that the vaccine is just a mechanism by which Bill Gates is implanting a chip in your brain to control you. So don't take the vaccine because Bill Gates is planting a chip in your brain. So yes, there's a lot of conspiracy theories. Blacks, there is a history, going back, I think, the 1940s and earlier, of blacks being used for medical research without their knowledge, where they were given drugs. Many of them got really sick, and they were just abandoned. And so there are horror stories in the past. The way parts of American society treated blacks in history is just nightmarish. It's just horrific. It's just evil. I mean, the Tuskegee, right? I think you pronounce it that way, right? So they're suspicious. Now, this happened in the 40s. And the fact that they're still suspicious is bad, and that indicates that their intellectuals and their leaders have continuously, I think the black intellectuals and black leaders in the black community are motivated to continue these conspiracy theories, to keep them alive, to keep the victimhood going so that they can stay the leaders. So I blame the state of black communities, the poverty, in some cases the ignorance, in some cases the conspiracy theories, on black leadership, on black intellectuals who have nurtured that, encouraged it. For nihilistic, disgusting reasons, for reasons to do with power more than anything else. Tuskegee, that's it. James says, plenty of videos of cops being shot on arrival. Yes, bad guys are bad guys. Criminals are criminals. And if cops are shot at, they should shoot back and shoot to kill. And if a cop is in a position where he thinks that his life is under threat, he should shoot. He should use his weapon. What I want is to train them so that they are better at identifying when their life is really in danger. They're better at being objective about that. And they're better at defending their own life, not only with a gun, but with other means. Because sometimes when a cop escalates to a gun, he puts himself in danger. So there are other ways in which to pacify. I want to give them more tools, not less tools, to deal with bad guys. I want to destroy bad guys. Bob Starfield says, I should call them conspiracy fantasies, not theories. Good point. And he says, encore. That sounds like an encore statement. Yes, these are conspiracy fantasies, conspiracy mythologies. And they're all over the place. They're all over the place in our culture. And it's a culture of mysticism. It's a culture of faith. It's an anti-reason culture. And the more our culture becomes anti-reason, the more conspiracy fantasies you get. And again, left and right, conspiracy theory, conspiracy fantasies are prevalent across the political spectrum. Across the political spectrum. And you see them everywhere. And again, it's a sign of a culture turning against reason. It's a sign of people rejecting reasons as reason's explanatory power over what's going on in the world. And it's an expression of people, the fact that people still need an explanation. It's what Ayn Rand talked about religion. She said religion is like a primitive form of philosophy. Well, religion is also fantasy. It's also conspiracy fantasy in a sense. But it's been around for so long, and it has something that, it serves some purpose in people's lives, and it's survived, but we gotten to the point where that conspiracy fantasy is not enough. They need to create new ones to explain the latest nuance. But it's all the same premise. It's all premised on a rejection of reason and acceptance of mysticism and faith. Okay, let me just see if there are $20 questions related to the issue today. Ayn Rand said one way to bring down the top is by elevating garbage. Leftist intellectual thinks blacks are worse, which is why they sought to elevate them to equality. Much of the civil rights movement was motivated by nihilism. I don't think that's right. I just don't think that's right. I'd like to see evidence of that, but it's just not right. It's true that you bring down the top by elevating garbage. But the garbage is, and you see that in multiculturalism, right? But multiculturalism is not about race. It's not about genes. Multiculturalism is about culture. It's about a chosen set of values. And what happens is when you elevate bad chosen values, bad culture, what you do is you're denigrating good culture. When you assume that all cultures are equal, you're lowering them all to the lowest common denominator. But that is not true of individual. That is not true of skin color. And I certainly don't think it was viewed by the left as skin color in those days. It wasn't like, oh, we hate blacks, we hate America, the way to destroy America is to elevate blacks. I just don't think that's what they were thinking. It's certainly false, but I don't think that's what they were thinking. I'd like, I'm sending you $50 anytime I see an unjust snipe at you on social media from people who should know better. Keep up the good work. Well, you're going to be spending me a lot of $50 in the months and years to come, but I really appreciate that. And yes, I know of the latest. Actually, there've been 2 snipes in the last few days, although I'm not sure one of them. I don't know if one of them mentions me by name because I haven't read it. But yes, I think I know the snipe you mentioned. The only part I'm not sure about is people who should know better. Maybe should know better, yeah. Should, but in this case, somebody I wrote off quite a few years ago, so who cares? I have a lot of people who hate me. A lot of people who hate me. And partially I view that as a sign that I've done good work. That has caused a lot of people to be pissed off at me. What I find tragic is that a lot of people who hate me used to claim to be my friends, or maybe just sucked up to me. I did a lot of good things for. A lot of people who hate me now are people who claim to be rational and objectivist and so on. And I thought they were once. So it puts more in question than anything my judgment of people, more than anything else. But I'm not going to comment on them because partially, and I've tried not to comment, and I regret that I've commented maybe more than I should even, because I think that their statements are mostly so irrational and so ridiculous that you should be able to tell that they're irrational and ridiculous. And if you can't, then, so be it. But I'm not going to defend myself against every irrational argument against me, every snipe and every attack against me. It's a waste of my time and my life and my energy, and it's just not worth it. So I thank you for those of you who defend me on Facebook and on other places. Thank you, those of you who recognize the injustice that is being committed. Thank you to those of you who stand up to these bullies and do that. I really appreciate that, and I think you should do it. I think it's justice to stand up to these bullies. I did that a long time ago, and on rare occasions I'll do it today, but it's just not worth my time. But if you value what I do and if you value who I am, then thank you for standing up to these. I won't say what. About race in film, I'm still not quite convinced, but I'd like to be. If you were to adapt, say, James Clavell's Shogun for film, would you cast a Peloponnesian actor to play a Japanese guy? Why not a woman to play a samurai? Well, particularly Shogun, right? I mean, James Clavell's movies have everything to do with culture, have everything to do with Japanese culture in this case, and its relationship to those who are not part of that culture. So it depends on the theme. If the theme requires that the actors be of a particular ethnic group because the historical, the theme, the history, that ethical group is relevant, then it's important. But if the theme is, even if it's set in history, but if the theme is, if the culture is irrelevant to that theme, then who cares? So, Othello is often played by a white guy. Now, he usually puts some paint on, blackface, what they call, to let the audience know that he's black because there's some significance. But the essential significance of the play is not about being black. So the identity, the fact that he's ultimately not black, and you know that, doesn't really matter because the essential theme is not about his blackness. Now, because it plays some role in the story, the paint is done to recognize that. But look, in Shakespeare time, men played all the female roles. I don't think that's ideal because the differences between men and female are real and substantive, not like the differences between things. So if the essence of the story is the history, is the culture, okay? But if the essence of the history is to convey something about, let's say you were doing something about Rome. You set a story in Roman times. But the story wasn't about Roman culture. It's just set in Roman culture. The story is about a grand love affair. Why can't you make, I don't know, one of the Roman noblemen who's fallen in love black? Or green or yellow or whatever. Asian. The whole point is to see beyond that and to look at what is he saying, what is he doing, and indeed if you did that, and I think we did that more, then the orientation would be not towards what does he look like. The orientation would be towards who is he, what does he represent, what is he doing, and what does he stand for. I think lots of historical fiction, the culture is now relevant because that's not what you're focused on. Or put it this way, that aspect, the aspect of the culture that has to do with race is not relevant. I think in Shogun it is. If you did something about slavery in the 19th century, it is. But the point is that, I don't know, you could do a movie about the culture of Rome vis-a-vis its decadence. And the people being decadent could be of all races. Of course, Ayn Rand couldn't be played with a woman of burqa because the burqa represents something. I mean, Jesus Christ. WPR, even for you, that is pretty... Anyway. So, if the theme is decadence, if the theme is not Roman slavery and Roman society vis-a-vis the Europeans and they were oppressing Africa and they're conquering the world or whatever, but they're just that they're noblemen who are decadent, then why can't the noblemen be of all races? What difference does that make? And I think when we actually get to the point where we make that kind of fiction, that's the point where we can focus on essentials, focus on what matters, focus on character. Oh, I see the racists have invaded the chat. What can you do? All right, let's see. Did that. Under Biden administration, do you think we will see more BLM violence or less? I think we'll see less. I think we'll see less. I think that, I think Trump brought that out in them. And it was partially, again, it wasn't about race. It was about rejection of America and rejection of Trump and rejection of a lot of things. Some good to reject and some bad to reject. It was a package deal. And I think that energy behind that is going to be gone because they won't want to undermine and undercut a Biden administration. Your Honor, although we want a colorblind society that judges individuals, it's fair to still call out issues with collectivist cultures and groups in America, correct? I mean, you have to be careful. You have to be careful. If you say, Jews overwhelmingly vote Democratic. Well, yeah, it's true. And why do Jews overwhelmingly vote Democratic? Ask that question. Yeah, I think that's a legit question. Are you guys getting video? Did you lose video? I've got a weird feed on my end. Not sure what's causing it. On the chat, are you guys getting video? Audio, video's fine. Okay, good. So it's just me. So yeah, you could talk about groups like that. You can say why is there a wealth gap between blacks and whites in America today? I mean, that's an interesting intellectual question. But you have to be very careful not to lump people in, not to come to conclusions about them as a race. You can come to conclusions about their culture, about shared ideas like Jews. Why are Jews leftist? Well, it has to do with something about their culture. And it's worth thinking about and figuring out what that is. But that doesn't apply to every Jew. It's obvious that not all Jews are like that. It's obvious that not everybody identifies Jew is on the left, just because most are. And you don't condemn them as a people for that. You might condemn individuals for that, but you don't condemn them as a people for that. And then you work on trying to change the culture. So these things are tricky. Orthodox Jews are generally conservative. I don't think that's true. I think ultra-Orthodox Jews are generally conservative, but I don't think Orthodox Jews are generally conservative. I'm not sure that's a good thing for either the Jews or the conservatives, to be associated with religious fanatics and maniacs like the ultra-Orthodox, who are true barbarians of the Middle Ages, who dress in black because that's what they dressed in the 17th century. And no rabbi has told them they can dress differently, so they don't. That's not a good look for anybody who claims to be advocating for anything worthwhile. Ben Shapiro is a Orthodox, not an ultra-Orthodox, but an Orthodox Jew. But most Orthodox Jews in America are not necessarily conservative, I don't think. And even there, the very fact that he wears a yarmulke, you know, it tells you something about how religious he is. I mean, I always say this about the Jewish religion. The Jewish religion, one of its great virtues is that you can tell how religious a person is by their dress code. I can tell by the kind of yarmulke they put on their head how religious they are. And so you know who to deal with and who not to deal with. So there's certain people I see, he's religious. I walk, I don't want to deal with him, right? But Christians don't do that. They give no external signal. They give no external signal with regard to how religious they are. So you can sit down next to somebody who looks completely normal, and they can turn out to be a Bible-thumping Christian and drive you nuts on a flight, and you engage with them in conversation thinking they were normal, and their religiosity only came out later, and now you're stuck with them. That would never happen with me and somebody Jewish. Could I immediately know how religious they are and know what to avoid. I'm not implying that ancient Rome slavery had to do with European and African. I know that slaves in Rome were from Germany or from Greece or from all kinds of places, and Africa. Slavery was viewed not in terms of race in Rome. I just used that as an example. Anyway, I used that as an example. Maybe it was not a good example, but I was not trying to imply that I didn't know any history. I was not trying to teach you bad history. All right, let's take a few of the other high dollar super chat questions, and then we'll go through the lower dollar ones in order they were received. People respond with mouth-frothing smears when you mention Ayn Rand because it scares them to think someone might read her. On some level, they know she's persuasive. Yes, and at some level, they know she challenges everything they believe in. At some level, they know she's the real threat. At some level, they know that there's something there that they should engage with but they don't want to. And it's easier for them to get angry and to froth and to get hysterical and to shun it than to actually confront it, because it really, really is scary, because they know it really, really is going to challenge everything they believe. How do you know everything isn't an illusion? How can you know for certain any particular claim is true? Well, because everything isn't an illusion. What does it mean to say something's an illusion? That it's not real, but it's real. I touched it, I see it. Now, you're saying, no, everything about you is deceiving you about this bottle of water. And my question to you, you're making a claim, is what evidence do you have of that? Other than it's a mind experiment that you can play in your head. What evidence do you have for that? What evidence do you have that all my senses, all my faculties are functioning against me, are functioning against me knowing anything? That my sense of sight and my sense of touch are coordinated in a way to deceive me? I mean, is there any evidence? And the answer is unequivocally no. There's no evidence you're just a brain in a vat. There's no evidence that you're just, the Matrix. None of that. And therefore, claiming that it's all an illusion is arbitrary. There's no argument for it. And the arbitrary for objectivists has no cognitive status. It's not false. To say that everything is an illusion is not false. It's not true. It's just nothing. It's not a statement. It's not anything that has any cognitive validity and therefore can be dealt with cognitively. Because how would I approach trying to disprove that everything is an illusion? I'd have to relate whatever you are claiming to reality, to my senses, to my mind. But wait a minute, you're claiming all of those are invalid. So you're invalidating my only mechanism by which to argue one way or the other. So it's a complete mind game that has no value and has no relevance and has no standing in thinking. It's not thinking. Talk about fantasy. It's pure fantasy with no connection to any reality or to any mechanism by which one can think. What was the second part of that? How can you know for certain any particular claim is true? This bottle is in my hand. How do I know it for certain? Because I see it. Because I feel it. Because I can look at it from multiple angles and verify that my first look was not false. I can bring it closer. I can bring it further. And I can examine it. And I'm still not sure. Maybe it's not a bottle. Maybe it's not. I can actually study its chemical composition. So I have multiple ways in which to validate what I'm seeing. But at the end, the validation is I can see it. I can feel it. I can touch it. Right? So my senses sometimes can deceive me. But my senses are the only way for me to discover that they deceived me. So at the end of the day, the only way to know something for certain is to see it, to touch it, to hear it, and to validate it by use of reason. All right. If we're dining outside and a group of protesters demands everyone put up our fists in the air and say BLM in solidarity, how should we respond? By refusing to raise your fist in the air and do it in solidarity. If you're dining outside and a group of protesters demand that everybody puts their fists up in the air and say Ayn Rand was a genius, you should refuse, even if you agree that Ayn Rand was a genius. If you're sitting outside and a group of protesters demands that you put your fist in the air and say America is a great country, you should refuse. Because you should not be coward, or you should not force, threats, intimidation should not be used even if the claim is true. And for example, during January 6th, the rioters, after, the ones that went inside Capitol Hill, when they left the Capitol, they were going up to people in the street and saying, in a sense, you have to swear allegiance, salute to Donald Trump. It's not just the left who does this. Bullies are bullies. And bullies should always be opposed. Bullying is evil and wrong. And it doesn't matter if the cause is a good cause or a bad cause. Bullying is wrong. How good, bad was Malcolm X compared to MLK? One Night in Miami is a good movie showing how intellectuals can influence the culture for good or bad. I haven't seen One Night in Miami, but I intend to. I want to see that movie. Malcolm X is a fascinating character. I really don't have time to get into it right now. Very, very mixed, just like MLK. But he was definitely on the side of, in the 60s, remember. American society is too far gone. Racism in this country is too far gone. What blacks need to do is form their own nation. They need to separate from whites in order to protect themselves. And I have some sympathy for that point of view. At that point in time in history, I think it was a wrong point of view, and I think it certainly turned out wrong, and I think it was the wrong approach to take. It was too defeatist. It was too negative on the potential that is America. But I can certainly understand him. He was a smart, articulate man who had bad ideas, who had the wrong ideas. And like Martin Luther King was tragically, I think, murdered. I read a biography of his years and years and years ago, but I don't remember that much. And there's a movie, I think, where Denzel Washington plays Malcolm X that's interesting as well. So he's an interesting character, very interesting historical character. Your Honor, you missed half my question yesterday. Sorry about that. What can small towns do to survive the pandemic, and what industries' ideas can bring capital people? Well, I don't know what small towns can do to survive anything, right? I mean, the job of a town is not, the job of a town, qua town, is not to survive. The job of the government of the town is to protect the rights of its citizens with the sheriff and stuff, and leave them alone. And then it's the job of individuals to find a job, be an entrepreneur, start a business, create economic opportunity for himself, for his family, for his friends. And what industries' ideas can bring capital people? Industries and ideas that make money. Any industry and idea that makes money. And particularly today when everything can be decentralized and you can work from home, anything where you can contribute value to somebody is something that can bring capital and people. So what small towns need to do is create as friendly an environment to wealth creators as possible, which means freedom, which means protecting rights and leaving business alone. Unfortunately, it's not just up to small towns because there's state regulation, county regulation, federal regulation. The town is just one small entity. But the more freedom you institute in your town, the greater chance you have of attracting entrepreneurs to that town. And that's what towns need in order to succeed. They need to be places where people can find jobs and make a living. Have you seen the musical Hamilton? Yes, twice. I saw once in LA and once in Puerto Rico. I enjoyed it. It's not my favorite because I don't love the music, but given the genre, I guess rap, hip hop, or whatever you want to call it, I like it better than most anything else of that genre. I think it's quite good. The lyrics are interesting. I think many of them are quite good. There's an example, for example, with whoever was asking the question earlier, I forget. But there's an example of, it didn't bother me that Jefferson was black. It seemed irrelevant. It didn't make any difference, right? Particularly given that the whole show really ignores the issue of slavery. Hamilton ignores the issue of slavery or it sidelines it. It didn't matter to me that the actors were black. The singing, the music, the dancing, the lyrics were all quite good. So I very much enjoyed it. Saw it twice. I don't listen to the CD because The music is not my music. It's not the kind of music I enjoy just listening to, but I certainly enjoyed the show. What are your thoughts on cultural enrichment and cultural exchange programs for young adults? Why are these no longer popular in today's academia? I mean, I like them. I think that there's an immense value in learning about other places and seeing how other people live, in traveling the world, in seeing other cultures, to learn from the bad things in them, to learn from the good things in them, to experience different things, to experience different people, different ways of thinking, to challenge oneself in different ways. I think it's very good, not because all cultures are equal, I don't believe that, but because you can learn something from almost any culture that's peaceful, right? That's not going to hurt you. Why are they no longer popular in today's academia? I don't know. I think it's because the whole idea of learning from others, taking the good and dropping the bad, that is rejected because everything's the same. You shouldn't judge. Part of experience other cultures is about judging other cultures. And cultural exchange was partially about judging others. And I think that's partially what's being rejected. Once you grant the premise that racism has such a terrible part of our history, how do you then explain why they should love America's history? Because America's history is what makes it possible to eradicate racism. So racism, particularly collectivism, has always existed. Tribalism has always existed. So the various forms of collectivism, including racism, have always been part of the world. And it's only the ideas behind America, the ideas that help create America, the ideas that are still prevalent in much of America, the ideas that are implicit in the very nature and character of this country, they are what make it possible to eradicate racism. Racism can only be eradicated by individualism. And the essence of America is individualism. And therefore, America is the one country that, in spite of its terrible history, brings hope and brings the solution to the evils of racism. All right, before we go on, I see Super Chat questions are coming in, but they're very, very low dollar amount Super Chat questions. While I appreciate them, I might not be able to get all of them because it's already an hour and 40 minutes, and we've got a lot of Super Chat questions. So if you want to make sure your question is answered today, make sure it's a $20 or more question, because it's unlikely that it will answer questions that are less than $20 that come in after now. All right, let's see. Before I forget, don't forget to like the show before you leave today, before you drop off. Don't forget to like it. We've got 120 likes. We should have 200 likes easy. So please like the show. Don't forget to share it if you like it, and support the show. Super Chat is one way. Of course, YuanBookShow.com/support, or Patreon, Subscribestar, or Locals. All of those are possible ways to support the show. All right, let's see. Once you grant the premise, we did that. Are nihilist intellectuals succeeding in bringing back segregation? Yeah, to some extent, I think that's true. I think the white nationalists, the white separatists want to create their own segregated communities. They're very much standing on that. But I think it comes from the other side as well. I think there's hostility towards mixed marriages on both sides of it right now. So it's very sad that we're seeing racism come back, in a sense, reemerge as a force in American culture. And this time on both left and right, on both sides. I think it's interesting that Asians are very successful in the United States, more successful on the average, but America is a racist country. Well, I mean, America was a racist country, right? And Asians weren't that successful when they first came here. And the first immigration law in American history was an anti-Asian immigration law to restrict the number of Chinese coming into the country because they were willing to work for less than the Irish and less than the Europeans. So they cut them off, both for economic reasons, but also because they were Chinese. And, Asians, as a race, do not exist because there is no such thing as a race of Asians. But people identified as Asians do well in this country because they have the racism against them as being far less than it has against other people. Think about Japanese internment. They've had blow after blow after blow against them. But they have a much healthier culture. And part of that is that they don't have a culture of victimhood. They don't have a culture that blames their failures or their bad stuff on past racism. And Asians have done well everywhere because of culture. Not because of race, not because of genes, but because of culture. And also, not all Asians, particular Asians, specific Asians. But if you look at the wealth in Malaysia, if you look at the wealth in Indonesia, if you look at the wealth in Hong Kong and in Singapore, even in Thailand, much of it is held by, for example, Chinese. There's something about Chinese culture that celebrates education, that celebrates ability, that celebrates hard work, that celebrates achievement. And it's the culture that inculcates those characteristics or helps inculcate those characteristics in individuals, and then they do well. Jews do well pretty much everywhere they go for similar reasons, because they have a good culture. Somebody says I'm claiming that the alt-right is as big as the critical race theory. I'm not, never have, don't make that claim. I've never claimed one is bigger or smaller than the other. Clearly, the left dominates our universities. It controls the universities, it controls the institutions of learning, and therefore has a lot more power, cultural power. But the alt-right is growing as a rebellion against that. And the alt-right is very prevalent online, on social media. And I don't know what the numbers are, people who take critical race theory seriously versus alt-right people. I don't know what the numbers are. And the alt-right disproportionately, during the Trump years, has shaped the discussion in a disproportionate way. There might be a small group, but they have spoken loudly. I mean, there weren't that many white supremacists, Nazis, and fascists at Charlottesville. But they made a big statement, even though it's a relatively small group. And they shaped the debate. Not just because the media pays attention to them, but because of their rhetoric, their nastiness, and because of the way Trump dealt with them. And critical race theory is more influential in universities. It has more influence on intellectuals. It's probably more people kind of intellectually adhere to it. But they, until BLM, until the marches, until the riots, they were fairly quiet. And then they dominated the conversation. And they dominated everything. So the alt-right is small but vocal and dangerous, and unfortunately there are a lot of people who quietly support some of what they stand for. The alt-left, call them, or the critical race theory types, dominate our universities. Both are out there. Both are influential. Somebody who doesn't watch CNN, it's amazing how I swallow it whole. Maybe CNN listens to my show and they actually pick up their storylines from me, because I don't watch them, so I don't pick up from them. So I'm not sure how this works. But, I mean, this is the inability of people to think, right? If you attack their sacred cows, like the alt-right or like Donald Trump or anything like that, then they can't categorize you other than CNN. It's New York Times, CNN, Donald Trump, alt-right, or whatever else they love, and there's nothing else. There's no, what it reflects is an epistemology of a caveman, of somebody at the perceptual level who cannot think, who cannot abstract, who cannot think that they're more than two possibilities, two boxes, two units. That's it, two of them. And you either with him or with CNN. Those are the only two options. There's no other options in the world that exist. It's worse than a package deal. It's literally the inability to think. It's the inability to conceptualize. But hey, they're listening to your own book show for some bizarre reason. I guess to get all riled up so they can get angry and get excited. And this is why they probably watch CNN a lot, because it's the same reason they watch my show, is to get excited and to get motivated to go and live their pathetic lives. What does Ayn Rand mean by a certain racial standard of features in a face with regards to beauty of different races of people? And what would that mean for mixed-race people? Why isn't this racist? Why valuable? I think she meant that people from different parts of the world, people from different peoples, people from different ethnic groups, have different facial features. And culturally, beauty for them is something different because of what they're used to. There's certain commonalities with beauty across people of all cultures. Symmetry, for example. But people who grow up in Asia are going to have, because of what they've been experienced, because of the images they've seen and their own experience and their own life, they're going to have a different image of what beauty is than somebody who grew up in somewhere else where people look differently. So I think she's using racial in this context. Now, what about mixed race people? Well, as the world becomes more globalized, these things fall away. They fall apart, right? Because as people intermarry, as there's more mixed race, but more than that, as we're growing up, we're exposed to people from different backgrounds in terms of their looks, then beauty becomes a universal concept. So, you know, there's lots of, if you look today in Asia at their ideal of beauty in billboards, in marketing campaigns for makeup, it's Caucasians. Caucasian means from the Caucasus, which is kind of weird because, anyway, most people who identify as Caucasians are not from the Caucasus. But the features of Westerners. So our view of beauty is going to change as the world becomes more globalized and we're exposed to more different people. Just like historically, you loved the food you grew up on. But today, you're exposed to so many different foods that the food that you love probably has nothing to do with what foods your ancestors ate. So globalization is going to change our standards of beauty, standards of what food is, things like that. And of course, well, the standards of beauty is not innate. You can see that by the fact that as people are exposed to different cultures and different people, their view of beauty changes. But there is something innate. There is something innate in the attractiveness of certain things, like symmetry. And then if you value life, then you value efficaciousness. There's something about beauty that relates to being efficacious in the world. But that's you'd have to have a whole theory of beauty. We'd have to talk about that. That's a whole different topic that we're not going to talk about today. Unless you ask me a really big dollar related question. Yeah, I think generally there is a great value in having this globalized exposure. Right? Globalization is a fantastic thing. Some of the worst victims of racism, obsessives are the individuals and minority groups who want to be defined by merit, not by their race. Absolutely. I mean, the worst victims, not some of the worst victims of racism today, put aside lynching, right, are people who are ambitious, people who want to be evaluated by their character and their merit, and are not allowed to, sometimes by the people around them in their own culture, and then people outside of their culture. So, for example, there are some part of black culture involves, in high school, for example, making fun of the kids who study hard and really want to do well in school. And they're considered white for studying hard and wanting to do well in school. Now, I know this is not everywhere. I know this is not everyone. But to the extent that it exists, it's bad and wrong. Right? And should be condemned. And cultures like that are what perpetuate things like poverty and injustice and racism and horror. If Ayn Rand came back today, would she be shocked but not surprised? Yeah, I think she'd be, I don't know. I think she would be not surprised, although she'd be surprised at some things. I think towards the end of her life, she realized the danger that religion represented in America. So I think she would have seen that coming, and with that, the collectivism and the authoritarianism, I don't think would have shocked her. Maybe that we're still around would shock her. Maybe that we're still doing okay economically would shock her. Because you would think that the consequences would have been worse. And people still think that. And anyway. Have you read Amy Peacock's article regarding Paula? If so, thoughts? I have. There's sections of it I disagree with. But I'm going to air my disagreements with Amy first before I do it publicly with you guys. So, I think I don't quite buy this idea of censorship by proxy, although I understand what she's getting at. What she's getting at is an identification of something real and a real problem. It's a problem that is far bigger outside of tech than in tech. It's in energy, and I'm actually going to be on Alex Epstein's show podcast to talk about this as it relates to energy and finance. It's huge in finance. And that is the impact government has by just being there, or by just suggesting to business they might want to take a particular position or not. I think we have to be very clear on who the villain is, and we have to be very clear on what the remedy is. And the villain is government, and the remedy is the government to stop and separate itself. I think it's very dangerous to pass the blame on to the business, because force, whether implicit or explicit, is being used against them. And I think it's also, I think then you have to be very careful on where you identify the violation of the First Amendment. I think you have to make it clear that the violation of the First Amendment is the government putting pressure on the platform, not the platform's actions. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I plan to do that with Amy. And then there's some other things about, there's one other thing I disagreed with. But generally, she's fighting, she's struggling to I don't know what I think of the business, core business. I haven't been on Parler very much. I'm not a big fan of most of the people who are on Parler in terms of the personalities that are on there. And, but, you know, it's a business, a legit business. I understand that they're going to be up and running probably by the end of the month. And, you know, she's doing a good job representing the business she's in, whether I agree with everything she says or not. And again, I have enough respect for Amy to want to hash out our differences in person. Will police shrug if BLM movement persists? No, I mean, I actually think under Biden, police will be tougher with BLM than under Trump. I think under Trump, Trump and I think everybody it was perceived as the BLM movement was perceived as anti-Trump, so everybody was anti-Trump, went along with them. But if BLM is perceived as anti-Biden, a lot of Biden supporters, a lot of mayors and governors and other political people and political leadership or other leftists could support clamping down on BLM. White race realists also claim a higher intelligence of Asians and whites. So are they also Asian supremacists or on top of white supremacists? You know, this is what they do, and this is what I see them do both with Asians and with Jews. They say, yeah, Jews are smarter than whites, but Jews use it for nefarious purposes. They undercut, so they say, yeah, they're smarter in IQ, but IQ is not everything. It's their morality. And to some extent, they attribute that to East Asians, particularly Chinese. That, yes, they're smarter, but morally, they're horrific. Morally, they're condemnable. Power-wise, they want power over us. So we must fight them even though they're, quote, superior. But the whole issue of IQ is bogus. And IQ is not intelligence. And there's no reason to think that Asians are more intelligent than whites. Or which Asian, which white? What does intelligence mean? Intelligence doing what? Intelligence in what field? Applied how? Thanks, Rich. Why are the fastest runners in the world all of African descent? Why did European industrialize first? Man, that's why I got a lot of low-dollar questions. It's all the racists came on, and they don't want to support the show with a lot of money, but they still want me to address these issues because they think they got me. I've answered these questions 1,000 times. People have different genetic endowment physically. Individuals have different genetic endowments biologically too. I mean, different physical and intellectual endowments. Some of intelligence is caused by genes at the individual level. Now, it's not true that the fastest runners in the world are of African descent always. Depends on the kind of running. Depends on the time frame you're talking about. Always, not always the case, but it is true that people of a certain genetic makeup run faster than people with other genetic makeups. Plus, they have to work really, really, really hard. It's amazing the difference between people with very similar genes and how some succeed at something and some other people fail at that same thing because some people work hard and some people don't. Kenyans who train at high altitudes and also have very low body fat and have very lean bones or whatever, light bones or whatever the particular characteristics are, and train really, really, really hard and work really, really hard and use the best science to train really, really hard, become the best long-distance runners in the world. Yep, that's absolutely right. So what? What does that mean? We are not a physical animal. evolution has endowed us with free will and with reason. We can overcome our genes. We can do amazing, stunning things. We can achieve amazing things in the realm of the intellect, which is what matters. In the realm of morality. In the realm of how we live our lives. Yes, when it comes to pure physicality, some people just have better genes than others. Even then, to be really, really good, they have to train really, really hard. Just, read up about Michael Jordan. I don't have the physicality to be a great long distance or sprint runner or to be a great basketball player. I don't have the height. Some tribes in Africa who happen to be black are very tall. Some tribes in Africa are short. So what does that have to do with anything? All right. Why did Europeans industrialize first? Because of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, because they rediscovered Greek ideas. The Arabs could have industrialized before that, but they abandoned Aristotle in around 1150. If they had kept going with Aristotle and Greek ideas, they might have industrialized hundreds of years before Europeans. The Chinese, unfortunately, never had Aristotle. So they never really discovered him. They never really made him part of the culture, and therefore they never, even though they were far ahead of the West in different points in history, they never made the next leap because they lacked the missing link of ideas. So by accident, it happened to be that Europeans got a hold of Aristotle and sustained an interest in Aristotle for longer and more consistently than any other peoples, and that's why they industrialized first. It has nothing to do with the color of their skin. I mean, the Chinese were way ahead of Europe in all kinds of ways, multiple times over the years. Look, IQ is not irrelevant. IQ tells you something. But how much of IQ is genetic versus cultural is a question. But then how much IQ tells you is a huge question. It doesn't tell you that much. It tells you a lot on the low end. It doesn't tell you much in the middle and the high end. At the extremes, it's very meaningful. But even at the extremes, I know a lot of people who are very, very high IQ and are complete idiots and have done nothing with their lives. I know people with low IQ who've done a lot with their lives, succeeded in business. But in the middle, between, 80 and 140, it doesn't differentiate you. Not in any meaningful way. Not in how you live your life. Not in the values you create. Not even in the kind of jobs necessarily that you have. And IQ is just one aspect of intelligence. There are a lot of other aspects of intelligence. IQ is one measure. And it measures how well you do an IQ test. And that's a proxy for something. But we have very little understanding of what a proxy's for. And statistically, you should read Nassim Taleb on the statistics of IQ tests. You should read Nassim Taleb on the statistics of IQ tests and what the statistics mean. He's a statistician, after all. He's not an intelligence guy, although he's super smart and super stupid in many ways, but super smart. So, and then there's a question of culture and language arts and language skills and what you're taught when you're young and how language is used when you're young and how math is introduced and how math is used and how logic is introduced and how logic is used. There's so many things we don't know about intelligence that all these people jumping up and down as if they're world expert because they read a chapter in Charles Murray's book and thinks they know anything about intelligence. You're just ignorant, and you're showing your ignorance, and you're showing your bias. You read a chapter in Charles Murray that confirmed your racist leanings, and you're celebrating it. And now you'll rush after Charles Murray no matter what he says. And then, of course, Charles Murray says a lot of things that, if you follow Ayn Rand at least, you would disagree with violently. But no, he's Charles Murray. He confirmed your bias with regard to race. Therefore, he must be God. Read, if you want a critique of the statistics, if you can read statistics, if you're smart enough, if you know enough about statistics, then read Nassim Taleb's critique of the stats behind the IQ test, and then come back and tell me when Nassim Taleb is wrong. Because Nassim Taleb, and even Jordan Peterson, he says, IQ is the number one determinant of future success. Well, even in the statistic, even in the regression analysis that he does, which is completely, utterly, I wouldn't say completely bogus, but is questionable whether you can do this kind of statistical analysis. But the social sciences is filled with it. And you guys, of course, reject that kind of statistical analysis when it's done on climate change. But when it confirms your biases, you embrace it. But anyway, even in that statistical analysis, even in that regression, how much does IQ explain a future success? 20 to 30%. And if you measure success in terms of economic success, in terms of money, as Nassim Taleb says, the only measure that is actually objective, if you take wealth created, wealth gained over time, right? And then you regress that against IQ, it's not statistically significant. It's not even statistically significant. So, it stuns me, but it shouldn't by now, right? That people who are so skeptical of the humanities, so skeptical of statistics, so skeptical of science and mixing statistics and politics and coming up with, latch on to some mediocre second-rate studies about IQ. And that becomes their marching orders. That becomes how their entire debate is framed. Use the same skepticism you have on climate change on the IQ tests, and you'll see that it has about the same legitimacy. Why would you uphold any political nationalism, even a completely laissez-faire American one? What about naquer? I don't know what that is. To be born. How is that virtue? I don't understand the question. I don't uphold any political nationalism. I uphold a nationality. I think a particular geographic area has a particular set of laws. And if you're born under that set of laws, you're influenced by it, and then when you become of a certain age, you have to decide, do I like this set of laws? Do I like this culture? Do I want to be here, or don't I? And then if you don't, you leave. One of the reasons I'm for free immigration is because I think people should have the choice of leaving. Because so many times, the culture you're born into, the country you're born into, the laws you're born into suck. And you only have one life, so you want to do better. So leave. It's easy. So I'm not an advocate of nationalism. I'm an advocate of the nation state because I think you need a geographic area over which a particular set of laws applies to so that you can have alternatives. But I don't care about nationalism. I care about the ideas. Greetings from Lima. You inspire overseas. Good. I've only visited Peru once, and it was a wonderful experience, and particularly I loved the food in Lima. Did you know Hernando de Soto is running for president in this year's election? Sadly, his pragmatism is not inspiring. Yeah, I've noticed Hernando de Soto's shift towards pragmatism, which is sad. I don't know. I wish these people wouldn't get into politics because, the uglier side is revealed, and you lose the same thing happened in Chile. But it's going to be interesting to see what actually happens. He's one of the better economists in the world today, and it would be interesting to see if he can win, and what he does if he does win. How much of his pragmatism dominates. Could Test Track Isolate be completely privatized in a society with no public property? It would be difficult to isolate. Certainly the testing could be. I think some of the tracking certainly could be privatized. The isolating, and in some cases, strict isolation, because if the disease is very, very deadly, I think that is a function of government. Testing and tracing is not necessarily, but isolating is. I watched the movie El Cid and thought it was very good. In the second half of the movie, an add-on to the play. Is the second half of the movie an add-on to the play? I think so. I can't remember. I saw El Cid a long time ago, and I enjoyed the movie and I loved the play, but I can't remember the relationship between the two. Sorry. Is it bad billionaires are buying all the land? No. What's bad about it? I don't know what would be bad about it. This is what's bad about it. It's that they don't see better investment opportunities. Land is not a great investment opportunity. Land is not the most productive investment opportunity you could have. Why are they investing in something that's not that productive? Why aren't they investing in new technologies? Why aren't they growing their businesses? Why aren't they? I prefer they invest in going to Mars than in buying land. So that's the sense that I think it's bad. It's reflecting of a certain conservatism. It's reflecting of that they are not seeing good investments. Not enough good investments. Was Venice the beginning of capitalism? Merchants and moneylenders, the pocket of freedom in the middle of the Middle Ages before the Renaissance. In some ways, I don't think it's the beginning of capitalism, but it's certainly trade. But in that sense, it's just Athens, right? Athens, Rome. Think about the roads. Why did Rome build roads all over its empire? For trade. They had merchants. They had moneylenders. So it takes a lot more than the trade, merchants, moneylenders to be the beginning of capitalism. It's ideas. And that's why the beginning of capitalism is the Enlightenment, based on ideas coming out of the Renaissance. Was the Dutch and latest British East India Company, largest company in history, a great thing for the time? Stock markets, piracy-free world trade. No, in the sense that it was given a government monopoly, so it faced no competition. It was a branch of the British government instead of being private. I think if it had been private, then there would have been less violence, there had been less oppression. Government could have still protected trade without protecting their monopolies. So I think you could have had a better outcome. Yeah, I get the commercial and farming land. Any prediction on who is going to be Trump's pardon list? Himself, his family, Rudolph Giuliani. There's who knows? I don't know. Everybody who stayed loyal to him. People who are loyal to him, people who have dirt on him. I think the whole pardon thing is ridiculous. One of the things I would change about the Constitution. I don't think the president should be able to pardon people like that. I think it's ridiculous. All right, everybody. It's been way over 2 hours. Bye. I'll see you Wednesday. Thanks for listening. Thanks for asking all the questions. We got through all of them. I'm surprised. Talk to you soon. Bye, everybody. I hope he pardons Snowden, but I doubt that he pardons Snowden. I'll be positively surprised